Teen treatment can feel super complex. We know that the sooner a teen can enter into mental health or addiction treatment, the better the outcomes. But it can be a real struggle when thinking about how to market a teen treatment center. I am Clint Malley. I've specifically worked with teen treatment centers from a full continuum of care. And my guest today is Jeremy Manet, who's worked with a whole bunch of aspects of teen treatment, including business development, admissions, and the marketing side. And we're going to unpack his 15 years of experience working with teens to help save you some trouble so that you can help more teens coming to your program. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Clint, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start with kind of the teen treatment industry, some of the troubles that you've seen when it comes to marketing to teens, or we're not really marketing to teens, are we? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about. What have you noticed that is uniquely challenging when it comes to marketing a treatment center that works with teens?
Yeah. And I think you touched on it. I mean, your client is the teenager, but it really is the family unit. And so you need to create content and create an experience that resonates with a parent. That also resonates with a mental health professional who's often supporting a parent in navigating this decision. And then you have to have a product there that also the teen responds to, because in many cases, the teens will look at the website and, there's so much fear that goes along with it, with going into treatment. There's a lot of horror stories out there that these young people have read about. So creating a space on your website where they feel seen and they don't feel like they're being talked down to, or that they're being, the identified patient or problem is unique. So parents are really driving a lot of these decisions, but there's always multiple layers to the marketing aspect.
Yeah. So you touched on two different things. One, you have three different audiences that you're marketing to: the parents, the teens, and often the referring professional. And by the way, all of them are using different language when it comes to how they are talking about it. Referring professionals often searching up adolescents. And if they're looking for a residential program, they're using the word residential. Yeah. Whereas a parent or a teen, they're looking up teen rehab, or they're calling it teen. Yeah. And they're using completely different language to be able to search. The other thing that you mentioned is buy-in, right? Oftentimes teen treatment programs, unless it's a very high security, high acuity facility, you have to have buy-in from the teen to be able to go there, right? And so your marketing and the way that you're presenting your treatment center has to display it in a way that makes them say, okay, this seems like a place that I would actually be okay with going. I'm not going to like it too much, but I'm okay with it.
Yeah. And the reality is most of these young people have only heard negative experiences, whether it's an inpatient hospital or a wilderness program or, locked facilities. I mean, there's been, a lot of documentaries coming out over the past years talking about the troubled teen industry. Mm-hmm. And, look, sadly, that stuff is all real. There's a lot of programs out there over the years and historically that haven't done things appropriately. And teens haven't been treated the right way. Now, there's a lot of really high quality programs out there that have unfortunately gotten kind of caught up in this troubled teen industry mix. But back to your point is like the teens need to be able to see that this is not, like you said, it's not about being happy or excited to do something like this, but they're also not being sent away to some horrible place where they're going to get treated poorly. There's a lot of really high quality treatment options out there where young people get treated respectfully, and look, we're dealing with behavioral issues, mental health, emotional health. There's going to be challenges and dynamics that need containment, but it's not about, punitive measures. It's not about being locked in a room all day. Most teen programs have lots of outdoor experiential components. And so highlighting all that. So the teen in that first time they look at that website, or the first time a parent or a mental health professional starts this dialogue, that when they look at the program, they see that it's different from this image in their head.
Mm. So let's talk about some of the challenges that are unique to teen treatment from a marketing perspective. What are some of the highlights or the big things that are completely different from when you're trying to market to adults or young adults?
I mean, I think the biggest piece is, you're working with a parent at a time when their child's in a crisis. It is, one of the scariest moments in a parent's life when they find out that their teen is, potentially suicidal or been through a trauma or dealing with, severe substance use issues. So you have a extremely vulnerable parent who is, dealing with a situation and a decision that they don't know anything about ultimately. They're in so far over their head. And, some parents have support in that process, again, from a therapist, sometimes consultants and whatnot. A lot of parents are just searching on their own in today's world, and they're looking at programs and, they're going on Google, and it's incredibly overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And the trust that you need to build with that parent for them to be willing to place their child in your facility, at this vulnerable time. And it's, again, it's incredibly scary, the thought that I'm, might not see my child for 30 or 45 days. So it's that trust building from that first interaction. And I think it comes with your website, how you're presenting yourself. And then it comes with that first phone call with admissions in terms of the timeliness of that call, being responsive, picking up at any hour. And then it's about how that person on the admission side is carrying themselves, knowing that this person is the incoming call is from someone in a crisis, and they're scared and beyond scared. I mean, they're terrified.
Yeah, let's talk about some of these details when it comes to the website. So one of the things I originally came from the education field. So I used to be a classroom teacher, worked with a lot of teens. And when I came into behavioral health, that was my experience, was just working with teens, right? I had never marketed to parents or anything like that, but I was good at marketing. So my first thing that I did was I listened to a lot of calls. And I know that you've done this too. Somebody who's a director of admissions, the best thing that you can do is to have voice of customer data, or VOC, and listening to the customer calls or listening to the client calls, probably the better term, the parent calls. And one of the things that stood out to me early is that parents are wondering, is it bad enough, or is this just experimentation? Yeah. Sometimes they'll catch their kid smoking pot or drinking, and they're wondering, is it actually a problem, or is it just my kid, trying new stuff? And so one of the things that was really helpful for me when I worked at Sandstone Care and did teen treatment was we put quizzes on every single landing page so that people could determine whether or not they needed care. And so it was simple yes or no questions, and it was developed by clinicians, but it was a very easy way for them to be able to tell, right? Are they isolating themselves more than others? Have you seen emotional outbursts, big changes of behavior, or friend groups? Have you caught them using substances? Have their grades dipped? Usually a 2-grade dip, from A's to C's, or from B's to D's, that kind of thing. And by putting that stuff there from the get-go, that was really helpful for them to be able to say, okay, this isn't just like a phase. This is something that my kid's really struggling with. The other thing that was really helpful for building trust was having a free parent support group that happened every week, right? You did not need to be a client to be able to do it. It was run by someone in our alumni program from the young adult side of the treatment center. And what really helped is them to see other parents who were in the same boat and to be able to compare their industry or their experiences. Because again, they're wondering, is my case unique, or am I all alone in this? And they probably feel really isolated. But seeing other parents before they've even had a decision to enter into treatment and seeing the similarities and hearing their words come out of somebody else's mouth is like a really helpful way to say, okay, this is something I need to move on. Or even, this isn't as bad as I thought. These folks are really have trouble. And I think my kid was just experimenting. Let's talk about testimonials, because it is a unique challenge.
Yeah.
What's the problem with testimonials when it comes to teen treatment?
It's just, it's such a tricky dynamic when you're talking about a minor, and wanting to put them on your website. And, there are times where it can be appropriate, where families, you might be able to do a testimonial with a parent and a child. But it brings up some interesting ethical challenges. And it also requires a lot of buy-in. Again, a parent needs to be comfortable with that. The teen needs to be comfortable. And I've also, I had a situation many years ago where we did a family testimonial, and a year or two later, the family called back and asked us to take it down, because they started to be concerned about, maybe some other people will see it, maybe it'll impact, this young person's experience in college or whatnot. And again, of course, we honored that right away. But I think those are unique fears that come up when you're talking about, real testimonials with a teen versus an adult client. And I think, touching on another piece there, I think the denial in this process for a parent is so real. Like no parent ever wants to send their child to residential treatment. And there could be times when a child is really struggling and you're in the admissions process, and then all of a sudden the parent calls and say, hey, they had a better day, or I see some positive signs. And I respect that. I mean, again, as a parent, this is incredibly overwhelming, and the denial piece is so strong that often all it takes is a little glimmer of hope for a parent to think, oh no, maybe I'm okay. And I think as a program, part of the challenges there is supporting that parent in the moment. Now, are they lying to themselves? Are they in denial? Are they maybe putting their child at risk by not taking action? Or are they right? Is this child maybe someone who's maybe on that edge of needing treatment? And maybe they can do okay with some PHP or IOP support without needing residential, and I think that's where, again, the ethics for teen treatment comes into play, I think, in a more severe and pops up differently than for adult programs, because it comes up on the marketing side, on the website, your reviews, the way you present your program, but then it also comes up, pretty strongly during your admissions process. And then once a child's in your program, and I think ethics in treatment are extremely important, whether it's adult or teen, but I think in the teen world, it takes on some different layers.
So when it comes to testimonials, I never included teens in any of the testimonials that we put on those pages. But what I found worked really well was using parents, right? Parents that were okay with it. 99% of the time, the person who is going to call a treatment center is the parent. And I'll even say that most of the time, the people who are calling the treatment center are the moms, right? They are the movers and shakers of their family. They are the ones who are getting it done. They are the ones who are saying, no, we need to make action. And so when I was marketing the treatment center, I was always thinking with a mom in mind, right? This also changes the types of places where you want to show up. For example, early on in my career, I was like, well, where do most moms hang out when it comes to like social media? And where are people not reaching out to them? And Pinterest was actually a big one, right? And so it was important for me to create a lot of Pinterest content, helpful guides, yes or no question types of things for teen treatment that would get in front of moms. And we eventually had millions and millions of impressions every month that were specifically going to mostly moms on Pinterest. And it was really helpful. But back to testimonial videos, moms, especially if you've done a really good job, are willing to like do whatever they can to be able to help support more people who have been in their case. They're very empathetic and they care and they want to see other people get help. So that was like an extremely helpful thing to have on our pages for the treatment centers. And the other thing was, if you can't use teens, which you shouldn't, I think it's probably not ideal, right? What you can do is get written testimonials from them that are never published and hire actors to be able to do the voiceovers. It is something that protects the identity of the person involved, but they say things that you could never write as a marketer. You could never write as a marketer, I thought this place was going to be super lame. And when I met there, I found people who understood exactly what I was going through. Those are words a marketer wouldn't write. But when you allow the teen to kind of speak for themselves, even if it's through an actor, you can use backstage casting to be able to find plenty of teen actors. That's one of the best ways I've seen to be able to kind of articulate the experience of the teen without actually putting them on screen, revealing their identity, breaking HIPAA compliance, and putting like someone who's at a very vulnerable situation, something on the internet that will probably be there forever. You have anything to add or things that you've seen with that?
No, I think you're spot on. And I mean, I think parents, like you said, parents are ones driving this ship, So I think when the parent testimonials are incredibly valuable, and I think one of the things I would always express to a parent when asking if they would be willing to leave a review or leave a testimonial is making clear to them, like, yes, this helps the program, but it really helps other families who are in the spot you were 30, 45, 60 days ago, where they're scared. They're terrified. They're calling programs. They don't know what's coming, and hearing it from other parents, like you said, changes that dynamic and eases fears more than any, website marketer or admissions person can. And I think really reminding parents of that, of the value they're giving to other parents in that earlier stage of crisis is incredibly important.
Yeah. So that's like the pathos side of persuasion, right? When we're trying to help people make good decisions, we use pathos or emotional appeal to be able to help get them there. And you're so right that asking somebody to do, it's one thing to say, hey, will you leave a review? It's another thing to say, hey, there's a free way that you could help other families who are in a similar situation with you. Are you willing to do that? And most of the time they'll say yes, especially if you've done a good job.
Yeah. And it's such an incredibly personal experience when your child's in treatment. So I think the initial reaction that a parent has when you ask for a review or a testimonial is there's shame, there's embarrassment, there's this idea that I don't want people to know what we've been through, the image that we have as a family or whatnot. I think that's changed a lot over the years, but that anxiety is still there.
Yeah.
But again, when you present it as a way to help other parents in a crisis, like that really resonates. And it's, it's true. And it's a fortunate kind of win-win where the program can benefit from that. The parent can feel really good about putting their story out there to help others. And then of course the potential person viewing that video who hasn't found treatment yet gets relief and support from that moment as well.
Let's talk about reviews for teen treatment centers, because we've talked about testimonials. I think video testimonials especially work really, really well, specifically moms, specifically parents. But you need reviews, right? This helps you with local SEO for your treatment center showing up at the top of the map pack for your Google business profile. It's often the first place organically that somebody's going to discover a center when they're looking for a residential treatment center near me or something like that. And so reviews matter and review velocity matters.
Yeah.
But it feels weird and is, again, a shady, unethical practice generally to reach out to teens who are in early recovery to say, hey, will you leave a review of our center? What are the complexities around reviews in general when it comes to the teen treatment industry?
Yeah. And kind of overlapping with the testimonial piece, I mean, you're really needing to talk to parents, it factors into alumni programming as well. A big component for adult programs, it's more complicated on the teen landscape because you're not reaching out to a minor post-treatment, like ethically, legally, like that's a very gray area that you don't want to go to. So you stay close to the family and find that balance there. And I think, while testimonials are always the most valuable, that requires getting a parent to your website to view them. And if you don't have a strong presence on Google and reviews there, a parent might never make it to your website, So I think that is, Google is often the gateway. And that's starting to shift. And, people are starting to use other platforms, whether it's a recovery.com or, an AI search rather than the traditional Google side. But again, those Google reviews those stars are often the first thing a parent sees. And, if you don't have a strong presence there or a good rating, there's a good chance they're not going to click to your website. They're just going to find the next program that's listed right below you on Google. So maintaining that review presence, finding that balance, I think there's times where you can get reviews from professional referral sources. And I think those are valuable to a certain extent, and I think parents want to hear from other parents and they want it to feel genuine, and I think parents often ask, what should I put in a review? And I think it's a very personal decision. I encourage parents in those moments to just be genuine, share what's comfortable, not to share anything personal about themselves or their child, but to share what their experience was like, and if there were certain aspects of the program that were particularly helpful for them and to touch on those sorts of things. But I think a parent, again, isn't about, leaving a review for a restaurant or something. It's such a personal experience. And I think parents often don't know what's appropriate to include. So giving them, some feedback there, some direction was always really helpful.
Yeah. The other thing that's tricky about reviews is that even though we're not going to ask teens to leave a review, they're still going to leave reviews. Yes. And oftentimes they're going to be leaving reviews, like most industries, because they have some feelings about their experience. Yes. If they were discharged from the program because they weren't like compliant with behavior, or they were doing things that were going to hurt the milieu or the population in there, they're going to be mad. They will find you. They're smart on technology. Yes. They're going to find your treatment center. They're going to leave a negative review. How do you handle that complexity when it comes to the fact that you can't ask teens for reviews, but they're still going to leave negative reviews?
Yes. And I think, look, having worked in this space for a long time, no program should have a 5-star rating on Google. Like this is an industry where we are not going to ever have 100% satisfaction rates. Yep. These are really complicated situations. They're nuanced, they're layers. Like there should be some negative feedback online. And I think quite honestly, when you communicate with your admissions team around this, and this is where it's so important, the dynamic between marketing and admissions and aligning there, and also notifying them of like, hey, admissions, we just had this review that got left, and it's something that might come up in this process, so let's talk about it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, like you said, the teens out there will find you. They will leave a review. There are going to be those early discharges of those clients who felt that they were wronged in some sort of way. And I think it's about owning that. And again, and supporting your admissions team and understanding that, and being able to communicate to a parent, like, yeah, this is challenging work. And there's times where, we collectively, whether through the program or through the parents, realize that maybe it's not the right fit. And I think it's important that parents understand the complexity of these decisions, that it is not a black and white process, and just owning it, and acknowledging that, that some of these reviews out there are coming from teens and don't always reflect the program's experience as well.
Yeah. There's two things you said here that I think are really important. It's like the communication between marketing and admissions. Yeah. So when I worked in teen treatment, one of the things that was really important was to help support the admissions teams with what I called obstacle overcomes, right? So this is where oftentimes an admissions person captures an obstacle from a parent. A parent brings up, I saw this 1-star review. What do they say, right? And what is helpful and what is not helpful? If you do not keep track of the obstacles, then you can also not keep track of the overcomes. Yeah. And marketing and business development need to help support in that. So for example, what you just said is a really helpful obstacle overcome that you can use with your admissions team, in that, like, I wouldn't trust any program that has perfect reviews, because what we do is so complex and there's a lot of layers, and we're working with teens on some of the most challenging times in their life. This is never going to be a 5-star review industry, and we expect that. But what we try and strive to do is to have much more positive reviews than negative ones, right? And so review velocity also matters there.
Yeah, and the authenticity of the reviews as well. So if you have, 5-star reviews that go into great detail about your program, touch on, specific aspects of the program, and then you have some negative reviews that are one line, or sometimes you have a teen that leaves kind of an incoherent review, that the rating will reflect one thing, but the quality of the review reflects something else. And like you said, that's an obstacle that an admissions coordinator can overcome if they understand the bigger landscape. And I think early in my career, I was really fortunate. I was working in a very small, just a 6-bed facility where I was doing the marketing and admissions. So I would be talking to families, hearing what they were responding to online, good, bad, indifferent, and, understanding that in the admissions process and then factoring that back into the marketing side. So I think I was really fortunate to have that experience fairly early in my career. because it really gave me a sense of like, okay, what are these parents looking for in their research? How do I make sure they get that on the website and in front of them quickly? And then it's a feedback loop. I would keep kind of refining the content and the presentation of information, and also what's most important, facility images, staff images, testimonials, opinions, making sure that what parents are looking for is front and center, as an operator, as a mental health professional, whatnot, we might think something's important. I know aspects of the program that I think are important that we market up front. Well, to parents, that's not their priority, and it's important that clinical information or program information is visible and present in the right places. But even though I think it might be the most important thing about our facility, that's not what the parent's first priority is. So it's balancing those two perspectives and needs.
Yeah. So you're kind of circling back to that importance of voice of customer data. And when you work at a small center, you do get the privilege of that. So if you're a treatment center and your marketing team isn't made up of parents who have teens who are struggling with mental health or addiction, and they're not listening to calls on a regular basis, then you are going to be missing the mark on your website copy and the things that you're writing, because you're writing what you think parents want to hear instead of listening to actually what's important to them. And as you mentioned, some of those things include facility images. I want to see the place where my kid is getting care. The other thing I would say, and this hits on ethos, which is like the credibility side, is the credentials and background and experience and therapeutic modalities of the clinicians who are going to be working with your kids, right? If you do not have smiling faces and pictures and bios on the location pages of your facility, then you are going to be missing out. If they can't click and see that they're struggling or their kid is struggling with trauma and they have a therapist that also specializes in trauma and EMDR therapy, they're missing out. And the common thing that I hear that treatment centers struggle with this, and I did at my center, was that because of staff turnover, it's easier to just put your CEO and your chief clinical officer on every page, because then you don't have to update the website as much. And if you have multiple facilities and a lot of turnover, then it becomes really hard to keep up with that. And that's also a problem if a parent admits their child into a care and they wanted to work with this therapist, but the therapist is no longer there.
For a parent, one of the most important things for them is to know who's going to be taking care of their child when they're in the program. And, and I think it's important that obviously your clinical team is up there, but also the support staff, and if you don't have an updated staff up on the website, parents are often going to call to question you on it, and I've had a case where a teen starts the program, parent reaches back out because the assigned therapist isn't on the website, and it just creates more fear, and I think those first few days in treatment with both the teen and the parent, it's about building trust. And that starts with admissions, but it really starts when they enter the program, because that's when the parent is the first 24, 48 hours, their anxiety is through the roof. So, if the program isn't aligning with what the website and admissions have been saying, it's going to create extra anxiety, and that has the ability to derail treatment, honestly. And it can really set back the entire process for that admitting family.
Yeah, especially if you think about some of the unique things that a teen might be important to a teen, right? For example, if you have a teen of color, right? And they're like, I want to make sure I have a therapist who's Black or a woman or whatever, or a man. What you want to make sure that that's also reflected, because I've had that happen where somebody's like, I came to this because you had a diverse staff and I showed up and it was different than it was advertised on the website. And that's not cool. And I'm like, you're right. And the other thing is like putting their actual credentials right there. So making sure that they're shown on the front next to their name helps to build that ethos-based credibility as well. The next thing I want to talk about is differentiation. So what have you noticed with treatment centers when they're talking about their center, and how do residential or teen treatment centers or even outpatient centers stand out?
Yeah, I think the last 5 to 7 years in the teen treatment world has been really interesting. There's been a lot of consolidation. We're seeing some really large companies start to stand out and expand their footprint, which in many ways is great because there's more access to care and there's more beds available than there were 5 to 7 years ago. But you're also seeing some changes in the landscape. Some long-term programs are shifting to short-term models. There's been a lot of closures, again, particularly with longer care models, wilderness, long-term residential, therapeutic boarding schools. So there is this kind of consolidation time that I've seen. Now, in the process, you also have programs that are marketing themselves very similarly. Like we're talking about evidence-based care, holistic, individualized, family programming. I mean, these are 4 basic components that every program should do, and every program highlights on their website. Mm-hmm. So it becomes even more important and in some ways challenging to differentiate yourself from the other programs out there. And it goes back to authenticity, to backing up what you say you do. The testimonials, the reviews all create that added trust because the keywords are very similar across the board. One of the real challenges in the teen treatment space has been accessibility. There's just a total lack of quality resources out there. There are states in this country that don't have any quality treatment options for teens. So families are often having to travel, which creates extra financial pressure, extra anxiety around being away from my child. And it's a really unfortunate reality in today's world that we just do not have the resources available to support young people. We're seeing a lot more insurance-based programs, which is great because affordability is a huge concern. The days of a lot of like out of network or private pay facilities has shifted to primarily in network, and the quality of care has become really strong. But it's also a challenge, when you have to deal with a out of pocket deductible, even for an in network facility, and then potential travel costs. It creates more barriers to care that really shouldn't be there. That it's a failure of us as kind of as a system.
Yeah, when I worked at Sandstone Care. Speaking about differentiation, and I'm going to talk about some of those elements you just mentioned. But when I worked at Sandstone Care, we had what was called the Sandstone 6. And the premise goes like this. If your marketing team, your business development team, and your admissions, and even your clinical staff can't off the top of their head explain the things that make your center different from other centers, then you are missing out and your marketing's not working.
Yeah.
That means that other people are saying different things. It's like musicians playing different songs at the same time, and it creates a mess.
Yeah.
And so in order for marketing to work, it has to be repeated. And in order for it to be repeated, it needs to be simple, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be said over and over again. So some of the things that are kind of connected with that, opportunities, so to speak, from what you mentioned, is that if you are a residential facility and you know that somebody's traveling to come to your care, marketing the fact that you do extensive aftercare planning so that somebody can continue their treatment plan when they go back to their home state. Hey, we're not going to just treat you and then send you back into the same environment with no support. We're going to help a transition plan is an extremely helpful thing. Yeah. We had the Sandstone Care 6. Some of these are things that you kind of have to mention, but then some of them are also kind of unique, right? So we talked about age-specific care. Obviously in teen treatment, that needs to be a must. Evidence-based, that's very typical with every facility now. It's like no longer cool for you to just do VIB type of treatment. You actually need to have some reasoning behind it. Individualized treatment plans, again, pretty stock and center. But some of the other things that we did that were a little bit more unique was we had really small group sizes. Yeah. We capped them at a certain size. We did academic and vocational support. So oftentimes, especially with residential treatment, parents are afraid that if they go to residential treatment, that they're going to fall behind in their studies, have to repeat a grade. So having a school system set up where they're communicating with their home school allows them to be able to not just stay up to date, but sometimes because they're in a better environment, get ahead, which is really cool for them. The other thing is the family component, and that can kind of get wishy-washy. But if you say, hey, we don't allow teens to come into treatment unless the family is an active part of the recovery process. Here's what that looks like. We have family therapy twice a week. You're going to do it virtually. with the therapist and your kid, that's actually a huge part, because if the teen goes to treatment and again, they come back to the same environment and the communication hasn't improved and we haven't like developed the skills across the entire family, then they're going to get right back into the same habits that allowed the struggles to kind of manifest in the way they did. And it's not because the parents don't care, they don't love their kid. It's just because being a parent and a human is hard in this world. And being a teen is even harder, especially with changing technology. And we need to have the skills, resources, and people to be able to tackle those things. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, one of the things you touched on that's so important is the alignment between marketing, admissions, and programming, and the program needs to know how it's being marketed, those direct care staff, the clinicians, the executive director. So it's like, there needs to be time for internal meetings and alignment between the three departments that are essentially, core to any treatment center. And you need to actually market to your staff and help them understand, because again, there's times where programs unintentionally mislead people, and it's a messaging problem, and it's about not just what you're doing, but how you're portraying it, what you're saying to families, because, your website and your admissions team can be aligned, and then your on-site staff can be saying the same thing, but in a different way that doesn't land with parents. And again, you have to remember the anxiety levels, especially early in treatment. Anxiety is through the roof in all-time highs, and the smallest little discrepancy or confusion can create a big challenge. So that alignment, I think, is so important, and it has to be consistent. Things change, and it's not just about once a year having a big meeting and getting everyone aligned. It's about consistently checking in between the different departments, knowing what are we doing differently on the marketing side? What are we changing on the website? What change on the program level that we need to update on the website? So it's not just a one-way conversation. This is not marketing talking, dictating things to the program. It's a dialogue both ways, because sometimes it's like, hey, we had this great, EMDR therapist that just transitioned out of the program. Like, we need to adjust our website and our admissions process until we replace that, because for right now we don't have that component to the program. And that's the reality. Things change, and that is what it is. It just needs to be constantly updated and maintained on the three different levels.
It's so true, right? This communication and not siloing things helps everything. So if your marketing team is not going and visiting centers, then that's a problem, because especially with teen treatment centers, when you show up, everyone's interested. All the teens are interested in like, who's this new person, right? And they'll often ask you, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I do marketing. So like the website and stuff. They will tell you immediately their thoughts.
Yes.
They're like, you said there was equine therapy. I don't see any horses around here, right? And that's a really helpful tool to be able to say, oh, we're having disconnect between what we're saying we're doing and what we're actually doing. Another really good example is that, and you see this especially with residential care, and it was really frustrating for me as a marketer, right? So I understand from, just a lay person. So I'm not a professional. I don't have clinical experience, just talked to a lot of clinicians and worked with clinicians. But we understand that trauma is at the root of a lot of mental health and addiction challenges. Underlying trauma, whether it's an acute trauma, some big thing that happened, or chronic trauma, something that's happened slowly over time, is a big thing that affects people. If your treatment center says that you're trauma-informed care, or that you focus and specialize in helping and supporting with trauma, but when the kid shows up, you don't actually help and unpack that trauma, then you're missing out. The kid is missing out. You're false advertising. And sometimes you're not getting to the root of the issue. And when I worked at a treatment center, we had a consultant, an outside consultant, come in and would ask, hey, the staff, the teens who were at the treatment center, the marketing professionals, you say you guys do trauma-informed care. Do you do trauma-informed care? Oftentimes the clinicians are like, no, we don't. Or the teens are like, we've never talked about trauma or anything like that. And we just focus on the skills. And when you ask why don't you do this? They say things like, well, in a residential environment, it's not good to bring something up that could re-traumatize them. Or first we need to, and this is a valid thing, first we need to resource the kids with skills and residential care to be able to regulate their emotions so that when we do bring up the trauma, they're not re-traumatized and they have the ability to be able to cope with it. Right. And so really, in order for them to be able to address their trauma, they first need to learn these skills. And that might be the case with some, but probably not all. And at the same time, we need to be able to like make sure that if that's the case, we say that clearly on the website.
And I think that's it. Realistic expectations. We're talking about a short window of time, whether it's 30, 45, 60 days. I mean, even if you go 90 days, like there's a lot of heavy lifting and emotional work that's going into this short window of time. And I think even in that, whether it's on the website or that first admissions call, it's setting realistic expectations with parents. It's like, look, we're not going to fix everything that's wrong with your child or your family in 30, 45, 60 days. That's just not how this works, and anyone that tells you otherwise is not being honest with you. So I think those realistic expectations, both around like the bigger picture in terms of what are the outcomes here? Like, what are the range of outcomes? And then also, realistic expectations of what the family and the client, the teen are going to get in this experience, and if what you tell them up front doesn't align, it's going to come back to bite you in the ass, and like you said, whether they view you as being dishonest or misleading, it can be a genuine mistake or a genuine, it's not always a intentionally misleading tactic. And I think that's where programs need to be really careful. You can be the most ethically, sound program there, but if you're not communicating and updating what you're doing constantly, you can unintentionally mislead people. And I've seen that happen countless times. And it's a lack of communication internally. Yeah.
Most people are just doing their best. They're not trying to mislead anybody. The thing you were doing that I think is really smart is using the approach of using a damning admission within marketing or on the admissions team. And what that means is that you say what the problems are before having to be asked about them. And it makes you come across as more credible.
Yeah.
If you upfront say, hey, this is a short window and this isn't going to fix your child. You're not going to get your child whole in 45 days.
Yeah.
So set that expectation. Usually we find that kids or teens who are in treatment for around a year see the best results. And so that's going to include a combination of residential, partial hospitalization, sometimes or day treatment, intensive outpatient, and then outpatient therapy. So we want to set that expectation. So I worked at like a full continuum of care where often people were stepping down from residential to IOP and things like that. And so the conversation was a little bit more streamlined, but especially with residential, right? Your whole goal is to be able to like get them to take that first step. And it can be really tempting to oversell something when that's not fair to the teen. It's not fair to the parents, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of parents do understand how complex the world is for young people. Like the challenges teens are facing today are wildly different than, 10, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, So I think acknowledging that, being upfront, communicating like what the goals of the program are. And like you said, stressing that like, this is going to be a longer process. We are this really intensive time to build this foundation and kind of get not just your child, but get your family back on the right track. But it requires work, and there's going to be, next steps post-treatment. And, with the reality of residential care being not always accessible local for families, that creates, the need for the facility to help set up aftercare planning. And that can be, there's obviously remote options today that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago, which are great. Having an in-person location just isn't always feasible for people, in terms of IOP or PHP that they can get access to locally. But the reality is this is going to be a little bit of a longer journey and supporting parents through that. And again, it goes back to what we've talked about a lot, just authenticity and trust. And the more direct you are and upfront from those first interactions on your website to those first few phone calls, that's going to set the tone for the next 30, 45 days, in terms of how a parent feels about the feels about the program, the trust they have in what you're telling them. If you get off on a rocky start, the family's going to question things early on. Like they're going to instinctively worry about the honesty or the direction of things.
Yeah. I wanted to circle back to something else you said earlier. There's a thing called internal marketing versus external marketing. Marketers, oftentimes when they enter the profession, feel like their whole goal is to talk to the public, whether it's B2B or B2C marketing, to go and to talk to the people who they're trying to sell things to. But just as much as you're supposed to externally market, it's really important to internally market, where you're talking to all the stakeholders at the company, gut checking it, making sure it's true because they'll call you out, and getting them on board with what we're saying.
Yeah.
I made the mistake early on in my career is thinking you could just, put whatever you wanted out there and then the other people would go and see it and fall in line. Yeah. And that's not the case. Oftentimes you have to get buy-in first before you do the external marketing. How did you do that process, in your experience working from the business development side and the marketing side to do internal versus external marketing?
Yeah. And having experience working in very small facilities and much larger corporations have given me different angles for that. In a small facility, it's easy. You can get the key stakeholders in a room together pretty quickly and make sure people are aligned and do that frequently. The larger the company gets, the more challenging that becomes. There's more players, they're more spread out, different responsibilities. But again, I think it's important that it's a constant check-in. It's not a once a year, we're going to get all the stakeholders together and align. I mean, that's important also, but it has to be maintained throughout the year because things are constantly evolving and changing in terms of marketing strategies. What are we focusing on these new campaigns that we're launching, and making sure that admissions and programming are there to back that up. And again, and it's a two-way street because things change on the programming level, and that needs to be known immediately so that the website can get updated, whether it's a staffing change or programming change. Those are really important pieces that, again, it goes back to, you can unintentionally mislead people if that communication is not constant.
Let's talk about content for a second. Content is something near and dear to my heart as VP of content at recovery.com. But oftentimes when it comes to content at smaller treatment centers or for teen treatment, they focus a lot on the transactional types of, either it's pay-per-click advertising or it's business development, and organic kind of gets pushed under the rug. When I worked at Sandstone Care, we got around 50% of our admissions through organic for a while. And it came through building a lot of trust and creating a lot of content. Yeah. How do you think about content when it comes to the teen treatment industry?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I mean, building out a reputation for your website that is evolving and maintained requires constant messaging, and I think one of the biggest changes I've seen in my about 15 years in the industry is the social media piece, and how essential that is to maintaining like your brand awareness and the channels that create. I mean, Google Ads has always been a key player and will be for a long time. The messaging that you provide in your content is essential in the marketing strategy, and there's so many more channels now than there were 10 plus years ago. It used to just be, Google, your website, your keyword ranking. Now that's all important. And there's this whole, AEO and AI evolving piece. But I think the more important one that's developed over the past few years is social media channels. The way that not just teens, but parents are getting information on social media, Meta, TikTok, all these different platforms. You have to have a presence there. And how do you provide content that is unique? We talked a little bit about some of the buzzwords that a lot of programs are using, but how do you put something out there that's genuine, authentic, and unique is challenging because of the product we're serving. And like we talked about, the challenges of, true testimonials and some of these pieces. So, I think being creative, standing out is what's most important, especially, when you're talking about, the social media channels. Where people are just scrolling. Like, how do you catch their attention, especially when you're marketing a service that people don't want to use. There is no traditional marketing funnel here where people are like researching well in advance. Like most families don't know they need this service until they're in a crisis. So, when you're thinking about maybe a bigger picture branding campaign, like how do you get someone to even be interested in looking at something or exploring it further when there's this inherent denial of like, I don't ever want to use that or need that. And I think that as a marketer, it's kind of a fun challenge. As a content creator, like it presents a unique challenge. Like, how do I catch someone's attention and get them interested in exploring something that they inherently don't want to ever need to use?
Yeah.
And it's a really unique challenge.
The thing that worked for me when it came to, social media is an interesting one, because if you go and you tell a teen, hey, we're thinking about this treatment center, it's treatment center X, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to look them up on social media.
Yeah.
And what they see there ultimately also determines their affinity towards the brand.
Yeah.
Okay. So on social media, like when I think about TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, we're using sober and mental health humor and tips and tricks. People are afraid to use humor on that. But if you ever look at any of like the recovery based community on social media, it's a lot of humor.
Yeah.
And that humor helps people feel seen. It also lets people know you don't take yourself too seriously. When it comes to blog posts or long form YouTube videos, you are answering the questions that parents are always asking when they call. So again, going back to your voice of customer data, and now with AI, this is like a really interesting thing is that you can field and understand. People also ask is a great way to be able to do this, but check what are the questions that people are always asking. What if everyone on your admissions team, instead of having to explain and answer a question, says, oh yeah, we created an article about that. You can see it here, or we have a video on that explaining this problem. I unpacked questions like, can I call the cops on my 13-year-old? Right? How do I know if my teen is trying to cover up the smell of weed in their house? How do I know if they're using weed? Right? How do I know? Again, this goes back to the earlier thing about, is it bad enough? How do I know if they're experimenting versus this is a problem? Another one is drug testing. Should I drug test my kid? If your center and local content's going to show up first, right? So you have that in mind. You may not show up nationally for that query, but if you can create a YouTube video or a blog post around those key questions that parents are always asking, arming your admissions team with that, but also allowing people to find that organically, it becomes a really powerful driver, right? They might stumble upon you because they're looking for an answer to a question and then be like, oh, hey, I actually need the service. And we saw a lot of conversion from those in a typically low conversion area.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's the piece there of like providing education and information and awareness to families. Again, like when a family finds, some pot in their child's room or gets a note from the school or, self-harm, which is a really scary one for parents and becoming way more prevalent. They see something or they get a first glimpse of a problem and they're looking for answers, and they might not even understand what residential treatment is. But if you can provide that resource separate from it benefiting your program or your visibility or whatever, you're providing a helpful resource to a family that's in some level of a crisis, and I think as mental health facilities, whether you're a trained mental health clinician or not, like that's part of what we're here to do, and if it's, of course we, wanted clients and have a program, but, there's a bigger picture here where we're providing resources for parents that are in a crisis, and those videos, that content, it can provide really helpful answers. It can also be, there's a branding piece to that, I think there's such a pressure in residential treatment, short-term ROI, like there's a lot of turnover, you have clients, admitting, discharging 30, 45 days. So I think programs get so caught in the short-term focus where it's like, there's the big picture of the organic growth, which comes through content that might not result in immediate admission, but is going to expand your brand awareness and ultimately help you in your lead generation.
Yeah. And My last thing with content is look at your competitors.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, there's a lot of places that need teen treatment. And so when we say competitors, it's a kind of a weird thing to do in the industry.
Yeah.
It's really funny because for a while when I worked at Sandstone Care, Newport Healthcare was the place that I really chased. I saw that they were showing up in a lot of search results and did a lot of things really well. And so they were the rabbit I was trying to chase down. And I studied how they did everything, right? How they did outcomes reporting, how they did their content. And later when I met, who's in charge of their marketing, Nolan O'Malley, no relation, I realized that we were both working towards the same goal. And there's a lot of things that he was looking at us for. And we were able to help each other. And it's helpful to you not have to reinvent the wheel. And so, especially if you're not in Southern California, but you're in any place else, look at what people who have been doing this for a minute are doing and follow in their footsteps in terms of content and bring your own unique clinical treatment center spin on it and create that for the people who you're serving. Because if anything, it's going to help them a lot more in building trust.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really interesting point, this idea of competition. The reality is, there are times where programs are, competing for a client. A client or family is going to decide between one or two programs. But I think it's been a positive shift to see how much collaboration there is in the space, in terms of supporting one another, helping move the industry forward. And it's been great to see over the years. I think there's been more collaboration there. And again, of course, there's a reality around competing for clients, but this is also, this is not a zero sum game. Unfortunately, there's more teens that are struggling than ever before. If you do honest, ethical work, there are clients out there that need your service. And I think that's important to keep in mind and maintain true to who you are, One other piece on social media that to touch on is, I think it's important also to understand the different social media channels, like what you're putting on LinkedIn versus Meta versus, TikTok isn't always going to be the same. The audience on different channels is going to be different. And even on Meta, for example, you're going to have clients that look for you on there, but there's also parents. So understanding the different channels, who's the target audience on each channel, and not just thinking you can, blast the same thing across 4 or 5 different platforms.
Very good point. I have a feeling that people who are listening to this conversation are going to want to learn more about you, the awesome work that you've been doing. Where can people go to learn more about you?
I'd love to connect with anyone. And, I enjoy talking about this work. I've been in the space for a long time. LinkedIn is a great platform. Happy to converse via email and happy to share that information.
I'll drop his email and his LinkedIn profile for you in the show notes of the description box on this video. Jeremy, this has been really helpful. Thank you for this conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Really enjoyed being here.
Again, if you want to learn anything more about Jeremy, check out that stuff in the description box and show notes. Remember that we're talking about business and marketing tactics. It's important to remember that the better our marketing and our business, the more people, the more teens we can help. And the ultimate goal and the reason why we're in this is because we want to help people and we want to help them make good choices when it comes to the care for their kids and support that they can get to hopefully live happy, healthy lives as an adult. We will see you on the next episode.